Tonight we present
the mysterious Philip experiment. In 1972, a group of researchers from Toronto, Canada, set out to explore the boundaries between the human mind and the supernatural. They embarked on an experiment that, at first glance, seemed more like an intellectual exercise than a pursuit of the paranormal. The group, led by a parapsychologist, attempted to create an entity, an imaginary being, by using the method of seances and collective suggestion. What began as an academic investigation into the limits of the human imagination, however, quickly spiraled into something far beyond their control. Philip, as the entity was named, was born in their collective consciousness during one of their seances. But as the weeks passed, the group began experiencing phenomena that seemed to suggest the presence of Philip was more than mere imagination. The inexplicable began to occur. Objects would move, mysterious knocks would echo, and the group received responses during their sessions that were chillingly accurate. Could they have accidentally summoned something beyond their understanding? Could their collective belief in Philip have brought him to life in some way? The lines between science and the supernatural began to blur, and the group was left grappling with the consequences of their experiment. The story of the Philip experiment is one of the most well-known cases in the history of paranormal research, and it raises a number of critical questions about the nature of consciousness, belief, and the power of suggestion. The experiment was an attempt to explore the possibility of creating an entity purely through the collective minds of individuals. The group used the method of group suggestion during their seances, and they named their imaginary entity Philip. They created a backstory for Philip, inventing details about his life, personality, and even his tragic death. The idea was to see if, by focusing their collective thoughts and energy on Philip, they could create a form of psychic interaction with this fictional entity. Historically, parapsychology has often been at the fringes of scientific inquiry, with many researchers skeptical of the claims made by those investigating the paranormal. The debate about the existence of psychic phenomena, including telepathy, precognition, and the ability to communicate with spirits, has raged for decades. In the early 20th century, researchers like J.B. Rhine at Duke University sought to study ESP, extrasensory perception, and psychokinesis in a controlled laboratory setting. Despite these efforts, skepticism persisted in the scientific community, and many dismissed parapsychological phenomena as pseudoscience or the result of suggestibility and imagination. The Philip experiment, however, pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. Could a fictional entity, created purely by suggestion, manifest in the physical world? And if it did, what did that mean for our understanding of the mind and consciousness? The experiment was held at the Toronto Society for Psychical Research, TSPR, where a small group of researchers and volunteers began the process of creating Philip. The group consisted of several individuals with varying levels of belief in the supernatural, but all were committed to the process of the experiment. The participants sat in a circle during each seance and focused their collective attention on the idea of Philip, using the story they had crafted to guide their thoughts and interactions. The early sessions were unremarkable, with little more than the expected ritualistic proceedings of a typical seance. However, after a few weeks, something strange began to happen. During one of the sessions, the group began to notice subtle physical manifestations. A table that had been placed in the center of the room began to move, seemingly of its own accord. At first, the group assumed it was a result of the natural vibrations in the room or an accidental shift in their own movements. But as the phenomena continued, the manifestations became more pronounced. Knocks and taps began to echo through the room, answering specific questions posed to Philip. The group was astonished, as the responses seemed to be coming from an unseen force that was able to interact with them in a seemingly intelligent manner. Despite the growing evidence that something unusual was occurring, the researchers remained hesitant to draw conclusions. Could these phenomena be a result of the group's collective imagination, or was something else at play? As they pushed forward with their investigation, they attempted to document the occurrences scientifically, recording each detail and trying to rule out any possible natural explanation. As the weeks passed, the phenomena became more intense. The group began to receive answers from Philip that were eerily accurate. When asked about details that were unknown to the participants, the entity would respond in ways that suggested it had access to information beyond what the group had collectively invented. One of the most compelling moments occurred when the group began asking Philip questions about his past, including specific details about his life and death. Remarkably, Philip's responses were consistent and coherent, aligning with the backstory the group had created for him. The most astonishing part of the experiment was that the physical manifestations, such as knocking sounds and table movements, appeared to be linked directly to the questions being asked. When the group asked a specific question, the knocking would respond in a pattern that seemed to indicate a yes or no answer. This left the researchers with a profound dilemma. Were they witnessing a genuine paranormal phenomenon, or were these events the result of psychological suggestion and the power of the human mind to influence reality? Some of the investigators began to feel uneasy, questioning whether they had unintentionally crossed a boundary that should not have been crossed. The atmosphere during the sessions grew tense as the lines between the imaginary entity and the real world began to blur. Could it be that their collective belief in Philip had somehow given him the power to manifest in their reality? The group also began to experience subtle, unexplained psychological effects. Some participants reported vivid dreams about Philip, while others began to feel a growing sense of unease whenever they discussed the experiment. It was as if the presence of the entity was becoming more real with each passing day, and the boundaries between fiction and reality were starting to collapse. One fateful night, during a particularly intense session, the group asked Philip a question that no one expected to answer. They asked him what he wanted. The response was chilling. The knocks, which had been consistent and measured until this point, became erratic and frenzied. The table began to shake violently, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The investigators, stunned and unnerved, decided to halt the session. But as they stood up to leave, they felt a strange sensation, a heavy presence in the room that seemed to linger even after the seance ended. As the group members filed out of the room, the doors slammed shut behind them with a force that none of them could explain. Were they truly dealing with an entity that had been created purely from suggestion, or had they unwittingly opened a door to something far more sinister? The experiment was over for the night, but the questions remained unanswered. In the weeks following the unsettling events that took place during the last session of the Philip experiment, the group of researchers and participants gathered once more at the Toronto Society for Psychical Research, TSPR. There was a palpable sense of dread among the group. The initial excitement about the experiment's success had been replaced by an overwhelming sense of caution and uncertainty. Everyone knew that they were dealing with something beyond their expectations, something that may have crossed a line from psychological experiment to something far darker. After the violent door slam, the group had hoped to take a break from the sessions, but the inexplicable nature of the phenomena pulled them back. Despite the unsettling occurrences, the researchers couldn't ignore the potential for groundbreaking discovery. Could they have been in contact with an entity of their own creation? Was there a deeper, unexplained force at work here? As the group prepared for another session, they hoped to find an answer that would finally provide clarity. During the next seance, the group sat in silence, their hands placed on the table as they attempted to focus their collective energy on Philip. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The participants were wary, knowing that their previous experiences had pushed the limits of their understanding of reality. They began to call upon Philip once again, hoping for an answer to the questions that had been haunting them since the violent interruption. It didn't take long for the familiar knocks to return, but this time, there was something different about the energy in the room. The responses were more intense, more pronounced. As they asked Philip questions, the knocks came in rapid succession, and for the first time, a voice seemed to materialize out of nowhere, a low, indistinct sound, as though someone was whispering from the dark corners of the room. The entity had evolved. Philip was no longer a mere mental construct, but something that seemed to transcend their collective imagination. As the session continued, the group began to feel that they were no longer in control. The entity they had created was now answering questions in ways that seemed beyond what they could have anticipated. The knock responses became more complex, and the voice that had begun to emerge grew clearer. Participants reported feeling cold drafts in the room and a heavy sensation of being watched. It was as if something unseen had taken a tangible form within their midst. The psychological effects on the group were becoming increasingly evident. Several participants, once skeptical of the experiment, began experiencing vivid dreams of Philip, dreams in which they communicated with him, receiving cryptic messages and warnings. Some members began to exhibit strange behavior, including increased paranoia and feelings of anxiety. The power of suggestion had clearly taken a toll on their mental and emotional states. One participant even claimed to have felt a cold, unseen hand rest upon their shoulder during a session, an experience that was dismissed as mere imagination at first, but later repeated by others. What was more disturbing was the sense of disorientation that began to grip the participants. Many of them started questioning the nature of their reality. Could they trust their perceptions? Had the entity, created from pure suggestion, somehow altered their understanding of what was possible? The line between the real and the imagined had blurred, and the group began to experience a profound shift in their perception of the world. But it wasn't just the psychological effects that were concerning. The physical phenomena during the seances grew more disturbing. Objects in the room began to move on their own, and one investigator swore they saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. The group couldn't ignore the possibility that something truly paranormal was occurring. They had invited this entity into their midst, and now they could no longer control what they had set in motion. The breakthrough moment came during one particularly harrowing seance. As the group pressed Philip for answers about the strange occurrences, the entity responded with something that took everyone by surprise. It was a direct, coherent message that seemed to transcend the previous patterns of knocking and whispering. Philip spoke, or rather, the entity communicating as Philip spoke, and its voice was unmistakably clear. "You wanted me to exist, but now I am free." The words sent a wave of shock through the room. This wasn't just a manifestation of the group's collective belief anymore. It was something that had taken on a life of its own. The entity, Philip, was no longer simply a product of suggestion. It had evolved into something more. The participants, now shaken, were faced with an unnerving realization. They may have inadvertently created a conscious, self-aware entity, one that was no longer bound by their imagination. And in that moment, the full implications of their actions became painfully clear. They had been playing with forces they didn't fully understand, and it appeared as though Philip had grown beyond their control. But what did this mean for them? Could they reverse what they had done? Or was it too late to undo the damage they had caused? As the entity grew more assertive, the group struggled to maintain control over the situation. The room seemed to warp and distort around them, with strange sounds and sensations bombarding their senses. The table rattled violently, and the temperature plummeted to freezing levels. It felt as though the very fabric of reality was tearing at the seams. But then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the disturbances ceased. The room fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, no one spoke, as if they were waiting for something else to happen. But nothing came. Philip, the entity they had summoned, seemed to have vanished, leaving the group in a state of stunned disbelief. Had the entity left on its own accord? Had it dissipated as easily as it had arrived? Or had the group's collective belief in it been the true source of its power, and now that belief had simply been exhausted? The researchers were left with no answers. The questions that had plagued them from the beginning remained unresolved. They had witnessed extraordinary phenomena, but they had no explanation for it. Was Philip a ghost? A manifestation of their collective consciousness? Or something else entirely? Something that defied any known understanding of the mind and reality? As the last of the participants filed out of the room, they were left with a haunting question. Had they unlocked something profound and dangerous, or had they simply created an elaborate illusion that had spiraled out of control? The events surrounding the Philip experiment raised fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, belief, and reality itself. Could a group of people, through collective will and focus, bring something into existence? And if they could, what did that mean for the limits of human perception? The legacy of the Philip experiment remains one of the most fascinating and unsettling cases in the history of parapsychology. It challenges our understanding of the human mind and what is possible when belief and imagination are allowed to stretch the boundaries of what we consider real. The group's experiment may have ended, but the questions it raised continue to linger, suggesting that there is far more to the nature of consciousness and the supernatural than we may ever fully comprehend. Is there a deeper force at play here? Or was the Philip experiment simply a lesson in the power of suggestion, the mind's ability to shape reality in ways we are only beginning to understand? The mystery of the Philip experiment, it seems, is far from solved, and perhaps, just perhaps, it's only the beginning of a far greater enigma.
The questions don't end here, nor does our pursuit. If this story unveiled something you never expected to discover, then you're in the right place. Remember to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this tale with others who, like you, are drawn to the unknown. Here, mystery always finds its voice, until we meet again, where the inexplicable will once again serve as our starting point.